Hello and welcome to the Chatterbox Letters podcast. Today I will be doing a special presentation, another special presentation. I will be reading my second self-published book, my sequel to the Minorities, the pilot. I will be reading to everyone the Minorities, Richard's Indiscretions, Chapter 5. I hope that everyone will enjoy my sequel while I read to everyone the Minorities, Richard's Indiscretion. This will be another huge letter that I will be reading from. It was the morning of Richard's funeral, Chapter 5, Farewell to Damnation. It was the morning of Richard's funeral. Silence consumed Eddie and Charlotte's virtue to utter a word about their son Richard and his indiscretions of when he was alive. Eddie tried to make peace with himself the very same day Sarah and Paul brought Paul Robert over for a visit with him and Charlotte. Torment got the best of Eddie. He never forgot about all the things and the love he tried to give towards Richard when he was alive. Eddie felt that he failed as a father for his son to turn out the way he did. Eddie considered his son as a monster, an evil force that engulfed Richard's soul and his way of thinking. Even his appearance was appalling. Charlotte was more umber about Richard than Eddie, being that she gave birth to what was once her son. She felt more love for Richard than Eddie would feel for his son at that time. Eddie's parents, Thomas and Gracie Morris, arrived from Alabama in time for Richard's funeral. At that moment, Eddie was consumed with emotions when he saw his parents. He came up to his parents and embraced them with love for raising him to be a grateful human being. Mama, Daddy, I really need your comfort right now. I'm going through so much until I can't take it anymore. I tried with my son. He disowned me and Charlotte as parents when we made visits. Next page. To the penitentiary, sooner or later we quit going to visit Richard. Right now I don't know how to feel at this point. I thought I could make peace with myself when Paul Robert came for a visit. Right now I don't know. Eddie's father, Thomas, took him aside to converse with him about Richard. You know, Eddie, I didn't raise you like this to be angry towards your son for being the way he was. You love your children regardless the way they act. You train them up to be better people, regardless. I know you tried with Richard. You gave up on him, Eddie, which in turns he gave up on you and Charlotte, and he felt that he didn't have anything to live for the way he see it. Dad, I had to let him go. Richard did not abide by my rules in my home. He took everything we tried to do for him to make him a better man and showed him down the throats. So he had to go. Eddie's mother, Gracie, gave Eddie a sign of hope in terms of giving his problems to the God for his healing process to begin. Eddie, you're my only child and I love you, but you need to stop feeling the way you do about Richard. Yes, he was a troubled boy who need you to show him that you really cared for him. Yes, I do agree with you when you put him out of your home because he didn't abide by your rules. You love your child anyway, regardless, your father stated. Give all this animosity to God and leave it there. Eddie understood what his parents was trying to say to him about Richard. He was determined to try and make peace with himself on account of his demised son. Eddie's heart continued to struggle to love his son regardless to what Thomas and Gracie said about loving Richard even in death. 1 hour after Thomas and Gracie's arrival, Charlotte's parents, Harris and Natalie Grant, arrived from Michigan 2 hours before Richard's funeral was to begin. Eddie answered the door for Charlotte's parents while Charlotte got ready in their bedroom for their son's funeral. Eddie sent Charlotte's parents up to surprise her with their visit. Charlotte had finished her beauty ritual before her parents approached the bedroom door. Charlotte opened the door and surprisingly was met by her parents as she was coming out of the room. Mom, Dad, hi, I'm happy to see you. Charlotte and her parents immediately embraced. Charlotte farther noticed her reaction after the embrace was her father noticed the reaction after the embrace was when she quickly turned away. Charlotte had cried not only for her son but for Eddie because of his attitude against their son. Charlotte's father, Harris, took Charlotte by the hand and led her back to her bedroom along with her mother, Natalie. Charlotte began to discuss Eddie's moves to her parents as bluntly as possible. Dad, right now I don't understand Eddie. His father had just finished talking to him about our son and the way he feels towards him. What I see was still animosity in his heart for Richard. Charlotte's feeling was mutual as she placed her head on her dad's shoulder for comfort. Harris sat down with Charlotte on the side of the bed along with Natalie. They consoled their daughter, Natalie, some words of advice. Charlotte, I feel you need to be patient with Eddie. He will come through. It's wrong for the way he's been acting about Richard, but he'll eventually come through with his feeling towards Richard. Eddie and his parents came upstairs into the room and saw Charlotte being consoled by her parents in tears. Eddie entered the room and came up to Charlotte concerned for her well-being and knowing she was upset for the way he was acting about their son. Charlotte stood facing Eddie face to face. She stood briefly, turned and walked out of the room. Eddie ran out behind her to console her. Charlotte would not let Eddie console her at that moment. She proceeded downstairs to prepare a light breakfast for everyone. Charlotte, come on, let me talk to you. What to talk about? You're not going to listen to me. I'm sorry for the way I've been acting out about our son. It's just, what are you going to say, Eddie? I don't know how to feel right now. That's my point. Charlotte proceeded to prepare the breakfast as Eddie walked away. Charlotte's parents, Harris and Natalie, entered the kitchen. Natalie offered to help Charlotte with the preparation of breakfast. Gracie came into the kitchen and began setting the table for All right. Next page. Their light breakfast. Eddie, Harris, and Thomas proceeded into the living room as breakfast was being prepared. 1 hour had passed, 1 hour to go until Richard's funeral. Paul Langston and his family arrived at the Morrises' household in time for Richard's funeral. Thomas answered the door for the Langstons. The Wilkinsons arrived at that moment when the Langstons were entering the Morrises' household. Thomas waited at the door while the Wilkinson exited the car. They proceeded through the front door. Donnie introduced himself and his family to Eddie's father, Thomas, once they were inside the house. Hello, I'm Donnie, and this is my family, my wife Judith, my son Daniel, and my daughter Emily. Hello, I'm Thomas, Eddie's father, Gracie. Gracie approached to the Wilkinsons at the door to be introduced by her husband. This is my wife, Gracie. Donnie introduced his family to Gracie. Hello, I'm Donnie, and this is my family. This is my wife, Judith, my son, Daniel, and my daughter, Emily. We are the Wilkinsons. Everyone proceeded into the living room for a gathering before the funeral. More people arrived for the gathering that Eddie and Charlotte knew. Emily and Sarah's friend Molly, Phoebe, and Annie decided to attend the gathering at the Morrises' household in support for Richard's parents. Denise was the last to arrive for the gathering, put her feelings aside about Richard and what he did to Sarah. She decided that she was not going to be devious as she considered Richard to be. The girls gathered in their own circle. They began conversing among themselves privately. Phoebe began the conversation directed towards Denise. She was surprised that Denise came to the gathering. I'm surprised to see you here, Denise. None of us expected you to come, considered for the way you felt about Richard. Phoebe, I decided to put my feelings aside about Richard and focus on today. I'm here for his parents. They're innocent, not Richard. Annie joined in a conversation with Denise and Phoebe. We're glad you decided to come and support Richard's parents. Denise, let's be cool and support Richard's parents. I agree, Annie. The girls rejoined the funeral guests in the living room for the gathering just before the motorcade arrived, for the entire room of guests was settling into the conversations and other things instead of Richard. Eddie and Charlotte were still at each other's throats about Eddie's attitude towards Richard. Some were emotional about the thought of Richard being demised so young. Others didn't seem to care about anything but something to eat. 10 minutes later, the motorcades arrived for all the funeral guests to be transported to the church. Everyone gathered outside immediately and waited to be loaded into the motorcades. Eddie and Charlotte and their parents were loaded in first motorcade and led the fleet of motorcades. They proceeded to the church for Richard's funeral. Eddie and Charlotte remained silent all the way to the church. Thomas was on the brink of disappointment with Eddie. Eddie, what is wrong with you? It's like what I said to you earlier, in one ear and out the other. Dad, everything is okay, trust me. The way You're carrying on? Who could tell? Charlotte turned the other cheek and looked out the window of the motorcade. 20 to 25 minutes later, the motorcades with the Morrises, Wilkinsons, and the Grants and the other funeral guests arrived to the church. They all proceeded to exit the motorcades and into the church for the eulogizing of Richard. The Morrises led their guests along with the funeral directors into the church. Eddie and Charlotte were confronted with the view of Richard's in his open coffin. Eddie and Charlotte came up to the coffin and saw their son. It seemed like he was just in a deep sleep, knowing that he would never wake up from that sleep ever again until Judgment Day. Eddie had a look of stone as he looked down at his son in the coffin. Charlotte leaned over into the coffin and gave Richard a kiss on the forehead as she bade him farewell. Eddie stood there stiff as a board, staring down at his son lying in the coffin. He thought of all the things that Richard had done with his life and the people that he hurt, put him in a position to pay the ultimate price with his life. Next page. Eddie's pride was weakened with his emotions. He began to cry fiercely over his son's lifeless body. Charlotte turned and began consoling Eddie as she embraced him in her arms. It's all right, Eddie. Let it out. Do not stop. Let it all come out. I know that you really love your son. I do, Charlotte. I really do. Come on, Eddie. Let's sit down. Eddie and Charlotte, along with their parents, sat in the first row seats in front of Richard's coffin, while the church filled halfway full with family and friends. The Morrises' family pastor eulogized Richard's funeral. He proceeded to lead everyone in prayer before preaching the word of the Lord. The eulogy of Richard before preaching the word of the Lord. Life was given briefly after the preacher finished his sermon. Soon after the sermon, Reflections of Richard was given in brief detail as his body was viewed by family and friends of Eddie and Charlotte. Thomas and Gracie consoled Eddie as he confronted to break down fiercely while coming up to Richard's coffin. Charlotte and her parents, Harris and Natalie, were deeply saddened by Eddie's pain. Charlotte stood alongside Eddie and his parents in front of the coffin. Charlotte embraced Eddie. I knew you had it in you, Eddie. I knew from the stone heart you had for our son would soften to the point that you still have deep feelings for your son no matter what he did in his life. Don't hate him or yourself. We tried. Eddie looked up to Charlotte and with a full face of tears as they proceeded to seat while family and friends viewed Richard's body. 30 minutes later, the funeral ended. Richard's body was carried out to the hearse, where it was placed in the hearse. Richard's family and friends were en route to the gravesite where Richard would be buried. The hearse arrived with Richard's body in tow, arrived at his eternal gravesite. Eddie and Charlotte and the family and friends unloaded their motorcades and proceeded to the gravesite. The preacher gave last words of Richard's eulogy before lowering Richard in the ground, his final resting place for eternity. Sarah watched as Richard was lowered into the ground. She had no feelings whatsoever for Richard being gone. She was relieved about never being hurt by him again. To Sarah, it was official, knowing that she would never suffer the fate of Richard's terror again. Emily confronted Sarah as Phoebe to Paul Robert in her arms. Molly and Annie walked over to the grave site where Richard was already lowered into the ground. They looked down into the grave. Molly was not so eager to know the person that Richard were. She was grateful that she never met the monster he came to be. Annie, I really don't understand this Richard character, but I'm really glad that I met the other side everyone was talking about. I look over at Sarah and I see that she wasn't even crying about him being gone. The way it seemed, Molly, what he did to Sarah and everyone he came in contact with and conspired his terror towards, maybe this is the right place for him to figure of speech. Molly and Annie walked over to Sarah and Emily and Phoebe. They formed a circle around Sarah and Paul Robert and consoled her. The procession of Richard's grave site eulogy ended. The family began their journey back to the Morris' household to gather for food and conversation. Eddie and Charlotte were silent the entire way back home. Meanwhile, at the Morris' household, family and friends gathered for food and conversation. Eddie and Charlotte's mother began serving the food. Gracie and Natalie noticed their son and daughter bonding after their disagreement earlier at the funeral. Before the funeral. That's what I like to see over there, Gracie. Charlotte and Eddie bonding, not letting their little disagreement hinder the memory of Richard. I couldn't understand why they were going on in the first place, Natalie. We didn't raise Eddie to act the way he did and hate his son because of his lifestyle. Looking at him at the funeral brought some change in his attitude towards his son. I saw it, Gracie. I would guess it took seeing Richard lying in a coffin to change Eddie's attitude about despising his son. Next page. Natalie, we better get this food out to the tables before everybody starves to death. It looks like everyone's going to start in on that tablecloth over there. They are getting ready to chow down on it. I agree, Gracie. Let us get this food on the table. Thomas and Harris came to the kitchen to help Natalie and Gracie with getting the food out to the family and their friends. Thomas noticed Eddie and Charlotte bonding. Harris, I guess it took looking down at his son in that coffin for Eddie to come to terms with the reality of his son being demised and how he felt about Richard. I saw them at the funeral, praise Jesus, Thomas. The gathering proceeded into the late afternoon with conversation among family and friends. Not one word was mentioned about Richard's life within the conversation. Richard's reign of chaos and terror would be forever buried along with him for all eternity. Day after the funeral, Eddie's parents decided to return to Alabama. Charlotte's parents stayed an extra day to help with the cleaning After the gathering, Eddie helped his father pack up the car. I see that you are much calmer, Eddie. You have not said words in days. What's up with you, son? What's going through your mind? I don't know, really, Dad. I don't know how I really feel about things in general. Seeing my son lie in that coffin really puts some things on my emotions. Perhaps love for Richard, Eddie. I guess, Dad, let us rest. Let's get the rest of your luggage loaded into your car. Thomas was concerned for Eddie's well-being and his attitude towards Richard's death. Thomas gave up trying to make Eddie understand the possibilities of a father and son relationship, even through Richard's demise. Thomas would never utter another word to Eddie and Richard about Richard again. Eddie and Thomas finished loading the car. Gracie, Charlotte, and her parents came outside of as Eddie and Thomas finished loading the car. Gracie embraced Charlotte. It was nice being here with you and Eddie in this time of need and to bury our grandson. Thanks, Gracie. We both appreciate you and Thomas being here for us in our time of need. Eddie come up to his mother and embraced her. I'm sorry for the way things were, Mama. With me and Charlotte, my feelings towards my son, everything. I just want you and Dad to know I'm really trying to cope with my feelings for my son right now. I just hope you both can understand what I'm really going through here. Put it in the Lord's hands and leave it there. He'll help you with all your problems and your attitude towards Richard. Charlotte's parents came outside to see Thomas and Gracie off as they prepared to get ready to leave for home. Natalie came up to Gracie and embraced her. Nice seeing you and Thomas, Gracie. I hope to see you both again on better terms instead of a funeral. Thanks, Natalie. Harris, it was nice seeing you again. Thanks, Gracie. Thomas, see you later. Be safe going back to Alabama. Thanks, Harris. Eddie embraced his parents once again before they loaded into their car. Eddie waved at his parents, began their journey back home to Alabama. Eddie, Charlotte, and her parents proceeded back into the house to prepare to clean up after the gathering. The next afternoon, Charlotte, parents, Harris, and Natalie left for their trip back home to Michigan. Everything was back to normal. Eddie and Charlotte walked back into an empty house. No sound of other family members gathering and walking around laughing and talking about things out of the ordinary. No signs of Richard anywhere in the house. Only good and bad memories remained as spirit lingered within the walls of the home. Eddie and Charlotte stood in front of Richard's picture once again as they embraced. Their feelings about Richard were unchanged. I just read to everyone Chapter 5, Farewell to Damnation. Boy, that was a powerful chapter, I got to say. It was very powerful, and I really enjoyed that chapter. All right, I want everybody to like, share, subscribe to my podcast. Hit that notification button to know once I go live. Ring that bell for updates on my podcast. And everyone, if you have a chatter letter you want to send to me, you can write whatever you want to write in that chatter letter, as long as you keep it clean. Write your letters clear and discreet. Send your letter to the Chatterbox Letters Podcast, Post Office Box 5556, Lakeland, Florida 33807. And please, everyone, please don't hesitate to send me your chatter letter. Please procrastinate and send your letter today.